Hello and welcome to Auto Shenanigans. How the devil are you? Have you had a good week? My name is John. Thank you very much for joining me for another exciting episode of Secrets of the Motorway. Today we're looking at the M80 motorway. It's around 25 miles long and first opened in 1974 as a short section of motorway running between today's Junction 7 and 9. A second section would come later in 1992, but it would take nearly 20 years for the final section to come along, connecting it all up and completing the M80 motorway. Before this final link was completed, the two sections of motorway were linked via the A80. And whilst this was a dual carriageway, it had several obstacles along the way, such as traffic lights and junctions, and these sort of things don't really lend themselves too well to linking two sections of motorway together. To solve this, they upgraded the A80 to create the final piece of the M80 motorway, and after 37 years, they could finally say that the motorway was completed. The M80 has 11 junctions in total, but of course we'll be starting at Junction 1, which is also known as the Proven Interchange. Here, the M8 and the M80 meet, and to build here, they demolished most of the original Black Hill housing estate. The housing estate was built in the 1930s to the lowest possible standard that they could get away with, and the plan was to take people living in slum areas and move them into these new houses. The area quickly gained a reputation for violence, crime and poverty. But when the M80 came along, it was seen as the perfect opportunity to demolish it. It can't be a crime-ridden area if the area doesn't exist. Just across the motorway and opposite the housing estate is the site of the former Proven Gas Works. It was built in the early 1900s to manufacture gas for use in homes. And luckily, there's a historical satellite image available so we can see the gasworks and how it was in its heyday. In the 1980s, the gasworks was significantly downsized, but it is still in use today, albeit on a much smaller scale. One thing that has survived, or should I say two things that have survived from the original gasworks, are the gasometers that you'll spot from the motorway. You can't really miss them. And according to one source, they're amongst the largest of their type in the country with a diameter of 85 metres. Combined, the gas storage capacity is around 566,000 cubic metres, enough to supply tens of thousands of homes, but only for one day. We said earlier that the M80 from Junctions 1 to 3 was built in 1992, and until it was all linked up in 2011, the M80 would have terminated at Junction 3, where you'd have picked up the A80 to continue the rest of your journey. Let's step back in time for a moment and see how the junction looked pre-2011. An interesting thing to note is that back then they built this extra bit of carriageway in preparation for the M80's extension. Today, there's nothing really left of the original junction layout. They've done a very good job of removing or covering up anything that was left over. Now at this point, I was going to show you guys the now abandoned Horns Hill Farm. Unfortunately, they've demolished it. In short, the farm was set up here in the early 1700s and was abandoned in 2018. I'm not 100% sure why the farm was abandoned, but I think it might be something to do with the housing development that you can't see just over there. Another possibility for the owners abandoning their farm could be that on Junction 3 there have been plans for some time to build a motorway service station. The first of these plans was put forward in 2005, but ended up being rejected for various reasons. For a few years it sat not doing anything, but in 2021 plans were resubmitted for consideration. So we might see a new motorway service station here at Junction 3 on the M80, but it's still in the planning phases. In any case, from the sounds of it, the farmers probably thought, sod all of that, I'm getting out of here. Junction 4 of the M80 required an awful lot of shuffling around of the local road in order to be built. Of course, we need to keep in mind that until 2011, there was no M80, and here's how things looked back then. Along comes the M80, and the entire local road structure has been rearranged to accommodate the addition of the motorway. Junction 4 is also known as the Mollinsburn Interchange, and it's where the M73 and M80 motorways meet. It's a little bit interesting because one set of slip roads for the M80 is found to the west of the interchange, and the other set sort of borrows a bit of the M73 in order to let traffic join and exit the M80. Still, it's got access in all directions, so that's fine. The M80 between Junctions 1 and 4 was built along a completely new alignment, but from Junction 4 onwards it follows the route of the pre-existing A80 dual carriageway. Well, more or less anyway, but when they built the A80, they built an elaborate junction linking it to the A8011. Today, it's known as Junction 4A of the M80, and whilst the motorway prompted a few small changes to the interchange here and there, it's mostly as per its original design. And you can tell it's of a 60s vintage design because it's absolutely batshit crazy, but functional. Junction 5 arrives almost immediately after Junction 4A, and when this was the A80 dual carriageway, it was simply a roundabout that caused no end of problems for traffic. With the M80 upgrade put in place, a proper junction was constructed to replace it, and all of the linking roads realigned accordingly. This has resulted in a small stretch of road that's been left and now abandoned for us to explore. It used to be part of the A73 and would head up to the aforementioned roundabout before the junction was changed. With the M80 upgrade in New Junction, the A73 was realigned, leaving this piece behind. And what I particularly like about this one is that today you can still see the yellow roundabout approach lines on the road. Between junctions 5 and 6 is Aria, or Aria. She or it is a 10-metre high statue created by Glaswegian artist and sculptor Andy Scott. It's made from galvanised steel and was installed at a cost of £250,000. I love artists. You guys know what you're doing, don't you? The sculpture has an internal lighting system that's designed to complement the shape and form. But it's daytime, so I've no idea if it still works. We've seen before in previous episodes that art installations next to motorways tend to get installed at a great cost and then forgotten about almost immediately, falling into a state of disrepair. Hopefully that's not the case here. Junction 6A was the last of the junctions to be built on the newer 2011 stretch of the M80 motorway, and just before you reach the junction, the motorway passes under a railway viaduct. We'll get to that in a moment, but first we're going to try and find the 18th century bridge that's hiding in the bushes next to the motorway and underneath the viaduct, somewhere in that direction. I'm not sure. I'll report back. Well, after quite a lot of faffing around, I have found it. And what a beautiful abandoned structure it is. The shadow you might be able to see in the background comes from the railway viaduct. As I say, we'll look at that in a moment. Anyway, back in the 18th century, this bridge was on one of the main turnpike roads that linked Glasgow to Bowness. And despite sitting abandoned and in ruin for years, it was still a consideration when it came to constructing the M80 motorway. It turns out, though, much of the area had already been disturbed when they built the A80 in the 1960s. At the time, nothing of archaeological value was found. And today, they just slotted in the M80 around everything. Onto the railway viaducts then, and this is the Castle Carry Viaduct. It carries the Edinburgh to Glasgow Railway across the M80, although it opened in 1842, so it predates the motorway by some margin. There are 8 arches on the viaduct, each at 15 foot wide, and when it came to the M80, this proved to be a little bit of a problem because it was only just about wide enough to fit 2 lanes through. The question is, what do you do with the hard shoulders? Well, in this case, you give them each an arch of their own. Junction 6A arrives right after the viaduct, and if you're travelling north like I am, you can't exit the M80 at this junction. I imagine it's due to space constraints, but there's never been an exit here as far as I know. The junction is also missing its southbound entry slip road. Unlike the north side, this was actually built but then removed in later years. I couldn't find any reason as to why though. Junction 7 hasn't changed since its original construction, and it marks the point at which we start to drive on the oldest section of the M80, which opened in 1974, running from here up to Junction 9 or the motorway's end. Junction 8 is where the M80 meets the M876. Be sure to check out my video on that if you haven't already. On the way to Junction 9, on your right hand side, is the Wallace Sword viewpoint. You can't really see it from the motorway, but there's a sword in a stone. I'm not sure, but apparently in Scotland, some guy called Wallace is a pretty big deal. From the viewpoint, you can see the M80, and on the horizon, wait, is that a quarry? We've not done one of those in ages. This is the Northfield and Boards Quarry. It sits pretty much directly opposite the Wallace Sword viewpoint, and interestingly is operated by a company director called Wallace. Quarrying at the Northfield site has been going on since the early 1900s, and today it provides a source of concrete, asphalt and various hard rocks. Despite its close proximity to the M80 motorway, I wasn't able to confirm if it supplied any of the building materials to construct the M80. It would make a lot of sense though, wouldn't it? Junction 9 is the last junction on the M80. Hang about, I said it had 11 junctions. It does, but there's Junction 6A, Junction 4A, blah, 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 blah. The total number of junctions is 11, but the last junction on the M80 is Junction 9. And here your options are either to continue up the motorway and join the M9, or leave the motorway via its slip roads to its end at a roundabout. By coincidence, Junction 9 of the M80 is also Junction 9 of the M9. So that's something. The layout of the junction hasn't changed since it was opened, and it features an oversized roundabout. Interestingly though, if we take a look on satellite images, we can spot the remains of the A872, which used to come through here before the motorway existed. And there we are then guys, that's all we've got time for this week. I hope you liked the video. If you did, there is of course a button specifically for that. And if you haven't subscribed already, please consider doing so. That would be wicked sweet awesome. Enjoy the rest of your week, whatever it is you get up to. My name's John, you've been watching Auto Shenanigans, and I'll see you guys next time for another exciting episode of Secrets of the Motorway. Till then, take care, bye bye.